Welcome to the Inner Essence, a space of mindfulness, spiritual awakening, and reconnecting with your true self. Breath, be present, and begin your journey with it.
Have you noticed that sometimes something inside you tries to warn you, but you ignore it? And later you think, I knew this was going to happen. What if that voice wasn't intuition at all, but something deeper, the observer, trying to express what your higher self can't say out loud? That subtle awareness behind every thought, the one that sees even your silence, is not imagination. It's the consciousness that perceives before you interpret, the part of you that knows without speaking. Today we'll explore what the observer truly is, why it sees what your spiritual self cannot articulate, and how noticing it changes the way reality responds to you. You've probably tried to be your highest version before, calm, compassionate, wise, unshakably centered. Maybe you've even caught yourself judging your own thoughts when they didn't match that image. The irritation you felt, the guilt for falling off balance, the subtle pressure to always be light, that's the moment the illusion takes root. We've been taught that the higher self is the purest form of awareness, the peak of inner evolution, the clean channel to truth. But that idea hides a quiet distortion. The higher self, as most imagine it, observes from within the system. It's like a lighthouse built in the middle of the ocean, radiant, yes, but surrounded by its own light, unable to see its own glow. What it illuminates, it can't always understand. Here's the paradox. The higher self feels eternal, but it's not omniscient. It experiences purity, but it can't fully witness itself experiencing. It's immersed in the field of being. It is the wave, not the vantage point watching the wave. So while the higher self is deeply connected, it lacks the small cutting distance that makes true observation possible. That's why you can meditate for years, cultivate serenity, and still feel lost when life suddenly shifts direction. The higher self stays faithful to the ideal of harmony, even when chaos is the teacher you actually need. It loves to feel whole, but not necessarily to see the cracks that make wholeness possible. And in that blindness, many sincere seekers mistake emotional stillness for clarity. Imagine a painter standing too close to the canvas. He can sense the color, the texture, even the emotion of the painting, but he can't see the full picture. That's the higher self, the artist inside the artwork. The observer, on the other hand, is the one who steps back. It's not detached, it's simply aware of the distance. It sees the stroke and the space between strokes. It sees you trying to be pure, and it knows, without judgment, that the effort itself creates distortion. That's the quiet illusion behind the idea of the perfect spiritual self. Perfection in awareness is not wholeness, it's paralysis. It traps you in an invisible mirror, forever comparing the now to an idealized image of serenity. You start filtering your emotions, avoiding discomfort, even censoring your own intuition because it doesn't sound elevated enough. The result? Your growth becomes performative. You stop feeling and start managing. If you've ever forced calm when you were actually angry, that's it. If you've ever pretended to trust the universe while secretly fearing what comes next, that's it too. The higher self in its idealized form can't handle contradiction. It seeks coherence through suppression. But coherence only appears when every frequency is allowed to sound. The irony is that the moment you stop trying to embody your best vibration, something remarkable happens. You start to see. The act of seeing, pure observation, dissolves the need for perfection. You begin noticing how your mind polishes spiritual concepts like armor, how it uses light to avoid shadow. The observer doesn't interfere. It just watches how the higher self tries to protect you from being imperfect. And in that watching, understanding is born. This is where the shift begins. The very clarity you were chasing through meditation, affirmations, or devotion wasn't lost. It was hidden behind the image of who you thought you should be. The observer waits behind that image, patient and silent, until you stop performing alignment and start witnessing your performance. And the moment you do, you feel a strange kind of freedom, the permission to be flawed and still awake. You realize that awareness doesn't require purity. It requires honesty. The observer doesn't need you to fix yourself. It just needs you to see yourself unfiltered. But few people ever reach that turning point consciously. They sense the distance, the slight tension between who they are and who they think they're supposed to be, and instead of leaning into it, they try to close it. They double down on the practice, on the mantra, on the next layer of spiritual discipline. And in doing so, they silence the very presence that's trying to awaken through them. That presence, the quiet one noticing your effort, has its own intelligence. It was born not in stillness, but in the first flicker of awareness that asked, who's really thinking this thought? It's not the higher self. It's something else, something older, more neutral and more precise. And it's about to reveal why it exists at all, not to replace the higher self, but to show you what it can't yet see from inside its own light. It doesn't happen in a single instant, but if you look back, you can probably find the moment it began. Maybe it was during an argument, when something in you suddenly stepped back and thought, why am I saying this? Or maybe it was a quiet night, when your own thoughts started to sound foreign, like voices echoing in an empty room. That's the birth of the observer. Not a mystical revelation, but the first subtle crack between you and the machinery of your own mind. Before that point, consciousness runs in a loop. Thoughts arise, emotions react, and you identify with the motion as if it's all one seamless current. You think you're choosing, but you're being carried. Then, unexpectedly, a thin awareness slips in. A second layer, a still gaze behind the noise. It doesn't judge, it just watches. And that watching changes everything. The observer doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with light or sound. It appears in the spaces between reactions, in the split second before a habit takes over. For most people, that first glimpse is unsettling. You feel both more alive and less certain. There's a sensation that part of you has detached, but not in the numbing way of dissociation. It's a detachment that sharpens your perception. You begin to notice how thoughts move, how they repeat, how they try to convince you they are you. Here's what few people realize. Intuition, that gut whisper of right or wrong, is still part of the internal system. It's born from your accumulated memories, experiences, and energetic patterns. The observer, however, sits one layer above even that. It doesn't feel the truth. It sees the mechanism producing the feeling of truth. That's the dangerous beauty of it, because once you've glimpsed this vantage point, you can no longer fully believe your own narratives. That's why some people describe the early stages of awareness as disorienting. They think something's wrong. I can't connect like I used to. But what's really happening is that the identification is breaking. The higher self speaks in the language of harmony and guidance. The observer speaks in silence. It doesn't tell you what to do. It simply reveals the pattern you've been following unconsciously and lets you see whether it still serves you. Imagine you're inside a theater, absorbed in the movie of your life. Every sound, every emotion feels real. Then, out of nowhere, a small click, and you realize you're also the one sitting in the chair watching the screen. The story doesn't vanish, but its grip loosens. You see the light behind the projection. You understand that even the higher self, that calm voice narrating your spiritual journey, is still part of the film. The one watching the film, that's the observer. And yet that awareness is not separate from the universe observing through you. It's not your creation. It's what happens when consciousness folds back on itself, when the field recognizes it's being watched from within its own frame. The observer is both personal and impersonal. It knows your story, but it doesn't believe it. It sees your striving for perfection, your spiritual ideals, and your fear of failure, all as patterns arising and dissolving in real time. But here's the paradox that few spiritual teachings dare to touch. The very moment you recognize the observer, the ego tries to claim it. You start thinking, I'm the observer now. You speak from that place, maybe even act as if you're more aware than others. And in that instant, you've lost it. The observer can't be possessed, it can only be witnessed. The moment you name it, it hides behind the name. This is where the real danger lives, not in the birth of the observer itself, but in mistaking identification for awakening. It's like standing at the edge of a mirror and believing the reflection is the one who's seeing. Many seekers fall into that trap. They start curating their awareness instead of expanding it, trying to maintain the state of the observer, instead of letting observation remain fluid and unowned. If you want to test this right now, pause for a moment. Listen to the next thought that comes up. Maybe it's "this is strange" or "I'm trying too hard." Now ask who heard that. Don't answer. Just feel where the hearing came from. That space, that quiet clarity, doesn't belong to your personality or your practice. It's the field of observation itself noticing its own movement. The birth of the observer is not an achievement, it's a fracture in identification that allows light to enter. And once it's opened, life begins to rearrange around it. Old motivations lose their taste. You start seeing how even your spiritual hunger, the drive to ascend, to heal, to align, can be another disguise of self-maintenance. And this realization can be unsettling, even frightening, because it dissolves the comfort of knowing who you are in the process of becoming better. It exposes a deeper intelligence at play, one that doesn't seek improvement, but recognition. Recognition of what's already here, quietly perceiving everything, waiting for you to stop trying to silence it in the name of spiritual peace. And that's where the tension begins to rise. Because most seekers, when they feel this awareness watching them, do exactly that. They try to quiet it. They try to meditate it away, confusing stillness with suppression. And that's where the next great mistake of the path unfolds, the one that turns spiritual seeking into spiritual blindness. You've probably been told that silence is the goal, that the mind must become still, the thoughts must fade, and the world must stop echoing inside you. You've been told that peace is the proof of enlightenment. But what if that silence you're chasing is not peace at all, but anesthesia? What if, in trying to silence the very mechanism that could show you the truth, you've mistaken quietness for awakening? This is the fatal error of spiritual seeking, confusing the absence of noise with the presence of awareness. Most people enter meditation, prayer, or spiritual practice hoping to reach a state where nothing disturbs them. But the moment you try to silence the observer, the very faculty that notices what is, you begin to drift into a kind of luminous sleep. You stop perceiving clearly and start curating serenity. It sounds noble. Empty the mind. Let go of thoughts. Rise above emotions. Yet every time you push a thought away, every time you chase the perfect stillness, you reinforce the illusion that awareness and movement are opposites. They're not. True observation doesn't depend on silence, it contains it. The sky doesn't need the wind to stop in order to exist. Think of the last time you were truly still inside, not because you forced it, but because something deep in you was simply present. It probably didn't feel blank or numb. It felt clear, alive, subtly vibrating. That's because awareness is not an empty room, it's a living field. When you force silence, you flatten that field. You create a polished surface, but beneath it the patterns keep pulsing, unseen, unexamined. Here's the irony. The higher self loves that polished surface. It believes stillness means mastery. It believes that to ascend, you must escape motion. But that belief blinds it. The higher self experiences the world from inside the light of its ideals, so it can't always recognize the shadows those ideals cast. The observer, however, stands slightly outside that glow. It sees the subtle tension of the one who's trying to be serene, the faint strain behind the smile, the tightness behind the mantra. When you meditate with the intention to erase experience, you don't transcend the ego, you perfect it. You create a spiritual persona who speaks softly, reacts slowly, and seems perpetually calm, but who is terrified of breaking that image. You start avoiding conversations that challenge you, emotions that expose you, and even insights that threaten your comfort. The tragedy is that the more peaceful you appear, the less awake you become. Real silence isn't the absence of thought, it's the absence of resistance. The observer doesn't need the mind to stop, it only needs the identification with thought to loosen. When you stop demanding that your inner world behave a certain way, awareness can finally move freely. That's when perception deepens. That's when you begin to see instead of merely feel balanced. If you've ever left a meditation session feeling strangely disconnected, as if the world had become too loud, that's a sign you weren't observing. You were suppressing. You were cultivating distance instead of depth. The observer doesn't pull away from life. It leans closer, with precision. It watches the flicker of emotion, the tremor in the chest, the way a single word can tighten the breath. Observation doesn't numb, it clarifies. This is why so many sincere seekers plateau after years of spiritual practice. They reach a point where nothing new happens, and they call it peace. But what they've actually reached is containment. They've silenced the very faculty that could have revealed the next layer of truth. The observer isn't there to be quieted, it's there to translate what the higher self can't express, the fine print of your consciousness that only still awareness can read. Here's a simple test. The next time you sit to meditate, instead of focusing on the breath or a mantra, ask one silent question. What is aware of this moment? Don't look for the answer. Just feel the act of asking. Notice how the question itself creates a subtle distance between attention and experience. That's the observer reclaiming its space. It doesn't interfere with thought. It surrounds it with clarity. Many traditions call that distance witnessing, but even that word can mislead you, because witnessing implies two entities, the watcher and the watched. The observer dissolves that duality. It perceives the movement of the mind the way light perceives dust in the air, intimately without separation. When that seeing stabilizes, silence appears naturally, not as an effort, but as a side effect of coherence. And coherence is not stillness, it's rhythm. Awareness breathes in waves, contraction and release, noticing and letting go. To confuse stillness with enlightenment is like mistaking the pause between heartbeats for the life itself. The body of consciousness needs both motion and rest, both silence and sound, to stay alive. The real danger isn't noise, it's rigidity. The more you control your inner landscape, the less space the observer has to move. The real peace you're looking for doesn't come from stopping the storm, it comes from realizing you were never the storm in the first place. But to realize that, you must learn to hear differently. Because the next mistake many seekers make isn't suppression, it's misinterpretation. They confuse inner hearing with true observation, intuition with clarity, and that confusion is subtle, seductive, and nearly invisible until you learn how to recognize it. There's a subtle moment, almost imperceptible, when you realize that what you've been calling intuition might actually be something else. It happens when you feel that faint internal alarm, the quiet sense that something isn't right, yet you can't explain why. You may even call it a gut feeling. Gut. But what if that feeling isn't the message itself, but merely the echo of a deeper seeing? What if what you're hearing isn't the truth, it's just the resonance of what the observer has already noticed? Hearing is a sensory event. It's vibration translated into perception. In the inner world, it takes the form of impulses, emotional tones, the whispers we associate with guidance or intuition. Observing, however, isn't sensory. It doesn't interpret through feeling, it perceives through presence. Hearing still belongs to the field of experience, observing belongs to the field of awareness. One receives signals, the other recognizes their source. Think of the difference like this. Hearing tells you that a storm is coming. Observing shows you the sky that produces it. When you hear, you engage. When you observe, you witness. Both are valuable, but when you rely only on hearing, you become reactive to the signals of your own system. The observer, by contrast, holds the silence that allows the signal to be understood, not just felt. Most people live entirely within the frequency of hearing. They listen to the moods of the day, the fluctuations of energy, the intuitive nudges, the yes and no sensations that seem to guide decisions. And while these sensations can be useful, they're also shaped by memory, desire, fear, and bias. The higher self often speaks through this channel, emotionally intelligent but still limited. The observer doesn't speak through it at all. It doesn't give you answers. It lets you see the emotional architecture behind your answers. That's why when you say, "Something feels off, but I don't know what," it's not confusion, it's clarity trying to surface through noise. The observer has already noticed the misalignment, but your inner hearing hasn't yet translated it into a language the mind can interpret. What you feel as unease is simply the vibration of that translation delay. Try noticing that gap the next time it happens. A thought arises, a decision appears, and immediately an echo follows, the subtle pull in your chest, the intuitive, Instead of reacting to that feeling, pause. Don't label it. Don't analyze it. Just turn your attention to the space from which both the thought and the feeling appeared. That space doesn't speak in words or emotions. It doesn't advise. It reveals. That's the observer, awareness itself perceiving its own ripple. There's a practical distinction here that changes everything. Hearing interprets reality. Observing updates it. When you only hear, you process experience through what's already known. You interpret signs based on your past. When you observe, you don't reference memory. You engage directly with what is. It's like the difference between reading about fire and standing close enough to feel its heat. Observation isn't reflective, it's immediate. But here's the paradox. The moment you try to observe deliberately, you're already hearing again. Observation cannot be practiced. It can only be noticed when it's happening. The observer exists prior to effort. That's why so many people mistake listening for awareness. They think they're tuning in, when in fact they're simply amplifying the inner dialogue. Observation is the instant before tuning begins, the silent backdrop that makes tuning possible. This is also why spiritual sensitivity can become a trap. The more refined your hearing becomes, the more noise you perceive. You start decoding energies, interpreting signs, assigning meaning to every flicker in your body. But in that hyper-attunement, you can lose the simplicity of direct seeing. Observation doesn't analyze signals. It holds them until they dissolve into understanding. When you observe, you no longer need the signal to be loud. In fact, it often disappears entirely. What remains is clarity without commentary. Perception so pure it doesn't even feel like an act of perceiving. It's not mystical, it's simply the mind returning to coherence, where awareness and event are one. And this is the quiet revolution the observer introduces. It's not about replacing intuition, it's about completing it. Hearing is how consciousness communicates within itself. Observing is how consciousness recognizes itself. When those two functions meet without conflict, understanding becomes effortless. You no longer ask, "What should I do?" The knowing unfolds simultaneously with the seeing. Yet, few people allow this union to happen because it requires them to tolerate a kind of silence that feels almost dangerous. The silence where intuition stops speaking and awareness starts observing. That silence feels empty, and the spiritual ego can't stand emptiness. It wants meaning, direction, assurance. It wants to hear that it's on the right path. But the observer doesn't reassure. It simply reveals. And that revelation can be unnerving because once you see clearly, you can't return to the comfort of selective hearing. The illusion of spiritual certainty begins to crumble, and with it the peace built on avoidance. That's why the next step on this path can feel like standing on thin air, because the silence that heals can also blind if you don't know how to stay awake within it. There is a kind of stillness that restores coherence, and another that quietly erases your ability to perceive. And between those two forms of silence lies the next threshold of awareness, the place where true observation can either deepen or disappear. There are two kinds of silence that grow inside the human spirit. One restores coherence, the other erases perception. They look almost identical from the outside. Both are calm, both appear serene, both carry the aura of someone who has found peace. But one is alive, and the other is hollow. One opens the senses wider, the other closes them behind glass, and almost no one can tell which one they've fallen into until something breaks the stillness. Most spiritual seekers are trained to pursue silence as the highest state of consciousness. They learn to quiet the mind, to dissolve thought, to rest in the emptiness between breaths. But if that silence is built on avoidance, it doesn't liberate. It blinds. It's a silence that polishes over noise without resolving it, like painting over rust. The surface gleams, but underneath, corrosion spreads. You can feel the difference if you pay close attention. Restorative silence feels transparent. It lets life pass through you effortlessly. Blinding silence feels thick, static, overmanaged. It demands constant maintenance. You have to stay centered, stay balanced, stay high vibrational. That's not peace. That's control disguised as stillness. And the more tightly you hold it, the more brittle your awareness becomes. Here's the quiet danger. When the observer begins to awaken and you start sensing deeper patterns in yourself, the impulse is to protect that awareness by freezing it. You start believing that motion or noise will disturb your inner equilibrium. So you create a shrine of silence, a mental monastery where nothing unexpected can happen. You retreat from conflict, from emotion, from the raw electricity of human experience. At first it feels sacred. You tell yourself you're not reacting, that you're above drama. But slowly your perception dulls. You stop noticing the micro-movements of truth that arise in messy conversations, in spontaneous laughter, in the awkward pauses of real connection. You confuse detachment with wisdom. What was once observation becomes distance. That's when the higher self, trapped in its ideal of serenity, begins looping. It recycles the same comforting thoughts. Everything is perfect, all is love, nothing can hurt me. Those phrases may sound enlightened, but they often serve as noise-cancelling devices for the soul. They replace curiosity with closure. And without curiosity, observation dies. The observer doesn't need silence to function. It needs transparency, a clear line of sight between awareness and experience. True stillness doesn't suppress sound. It lets sound echo through without distortion. When you lose that transparency, you stop seeing what's actually happening and start living inside the projection of what you want to be happening. That's the blindness of spiritual silence, when calm becomes a filter that edits reality. Think of a pond. When it's calm, it reflects the world perfectly, but only if the water is clean. If the surface is smooth, but the water is clouded, you get a reflection that's beautiful but false. The same happens with consciousness. Forced silence smooths the surface of the mind, while leaving its depth murky. You mistake the mirror for the view, and that mistake has real consequences. When life inevitably sends a disturbance, grief, loss, disappointment, the surface shatters. The seeker, accustomed to equating silence with alignment, panics. They think they've fallen out of frequency or lost their center. But in truth, they never left the surface. They just never learned to breathe underwater. The observer, however, was never afraid of noise. It was never trying to avoid the storm. It was trying to understand the weather. When you allow the observer to stay awake inside silence, you don't suppress emotion. You watch its rhythm. You let the sound of your humanity pass through the stillness without erasing it. That's when silence becomes sacred again. Not an escape, but a listening chamber for truth. Yet, this realization can be uncomfortable. Because it means your peace may not be peace at all. It might be a subtle resistance, a hidden exhaustion pretending to be serenity. It takes courage to test your silence, to see if it's transparent or opaque. Here's how you can find out right now. Sit quietly for a few seconds and listen, not for sound but for pressure. Is your silence soft and open, or does it feel like you're holding your breath? That's the diagnostic. If it feels tight, that's not stillness, that's effort. That's the higher self trying to guard its perfection. And if that's what you discover, don't rush to fix it. Just acknowledge it. The act of noticing already begins to dissolve the blindness. Observation re-enters through the very crack silence tried to seal. Because soon, and it always comes, there's a deeper possibility waiting beyond that fragile peace. The merging of awareness and essence, the alignment that was once considered forbidden, not because it's wrong, but because few are ready to see how powerful it truly is. But before we cross into that territory, take a breath. If any part of what you just read stirred something inside, a memory, a question, a discomfort, don't let it pass unnoticed. Write in the comments the first word that appeared inside you when you asked yourself whether your silence is alive or blind. And if this reflection opened even a small crack of awareness, leave a like as a way of saying, I'm still listening. Because the next step begins exactly there, in the faint hum that follows the silence. There's a reason it's called forbidden, not because it's dangerous in a moral sense, but because it dismantles the structure that most spiritual identities are built upon. The forbidden alignment is what happens when the higher self and the observer stop orbiting each other and collapse into a single field of awareness. It's the point where vision and being no longer trade places, where the one who experiences and the one who witnesses merge into the same presence. It's forbidden because it breaks the contract of separation that gives the seeker a role to play. If there's no longer a seeker and something to seek, then who continues the path? What remains of spiritual ambition when the hierarchy between the one who knows and the one who watches disappears? Most teachings avoid this convergence because it erases the ladder that keeps people climbing. The higher self has always been portrayed as the luminous guide, the inner teacher that channels wisdom, radiates compassion, and stands above the turbulence of ordinary life. The observer, by contrast, is quiet, analytical, detached, the still eye behind all experience. One feels, the other sees. One speaks in vibration, the other speaks in silence. And for a long time, they move in parallel, each trying to correct the other's blindness. But at a certain stage, the tension between them becomes unbearable. The higher self keeps repeating its affirmations. You are safe, you are love, you are infinite, while the observer starts noticing the mechanics behind those words. It sees the subtle need for reassurance, the egoic hunger dressed in light, and the higher self resists that gaze. It insists that faith is more important than analysis, that trust must come before truth. This quiet conflict generates a friction few seekers ever talk about, the war between feeling and seeing, between devotion and discernment. That friction is necessary. It's the heat that forges the union, because awareness can't integrate what it refuses to confront. The forbidden alignment begins the moment both aspects stop competing for authority. The higher self surrenders its need to define light, and the observer surrenders its need to stay untouched by it. When that surrender happens, perception shifts, not in content but in dimension. You no longer look at awareness or listen to guidance. You are the interface where both occur. It's like two mirrors facing each other, reflecting infinitely until reflection collapses into transparency. There's no longer an image to sustain. The sense of an inner voice speaking and an inner witness listening dissolves into one seamless cognition. You don't interpret reality, you participate in it. Knowing and being become identical. That's why this state feels almost scandalous to the spiritual ego, because it cancels the game of progress. There's nothing left to fix, refine, or reach. The mind, accustomed to measuring growth, panics in that spaciousness. It tries to re-establish boundaries. I must stay aligned. I must not lose this awareness. But the very thought of keeping it breaks it. Alignment can't be kept. It can only be recognized. And yet, in that recognition, life becomes extraordinarily precise. Decisions don't come from intuition or logic. They emerge from coherence itself. You find yourself speaking with an authority that doesn't belong to the personality, moving without hesitation, resting without withdrawal. There's no internal dialogue debating what's right or spiritual. Action and awareness are synchronized. Imagine tuning two musical notes until they merge into a single tone. A third frequency neither of the originals could produce alone. That's what happens when the observer and the higher self fuse. The resonance that emerges isn't personal, it's cosmic, but expressed through the intimacy of your own nervous system. You feel both microscopic and infinite, deeply human and quietly universal. And yet, this alignment has a price: the death of self-reference. The moment you start describing it, you've already stepped one layer away from it. Words fracture it even as they try to reveal it. That's why mystics have always spoken in paradox. I am nothing, therefore I am everything. They were trying to point toward the state where the seeing of the truth and the being of it are indistinguishable. But this merging is not a permanent achievement. It flickers. It arrives in flashes that can't be summoned, only noticed. The instant you attempt to control it, it recedes. It's the universe breathing through the aperture of your awareness. showing you what coherence feels like when no one is left to maintain it. And this is precisely where most people hesitate, because coherence without control feels like falling. It requires trust, not in intuition, not in faith, but in perception itself, the raw intelligence of consciousness unfiltered by story. To stand there unguarded is to let the universe use your awareness as its mirror. And for that to happen fully, something fundamental in you must stop resisting the translation between the invisible and the visible, the very translation the observer was born to perform. That's where the next threshold begins, the moment when observation turns from silent witness into translator, when the invisible starts speaking through every detail of reality, not as symbolism or message, but as direct communication, the language of coherence itself. At first, it seems impossible that awareness could translate anything. Observation feels passive, like standing at the edge of experience, watching it unfold. But that's the illusion. The observer isn't passive. It's the invisible bridge between two domains, the formless and the formed, the signal and the sentence. Its role isn't to speak, but to render what can't yet take shape. It translates vibration into clarity, potential into perception. The process is subtle. It doesn't happen through words or ideas, but through pattern recognition. Every event in your life, every thought, every emotional pulse, carries an energetic signature, a kind of texture that precedes meaning. The higher self feels that texture as intuition, but the observer doesn't feel it. It sees its coherence. It tracks the geometry behind emotion, the movement behind motive. Where the higher self experiences guidance, the observer perceives data. Imagine standing before a stained glass window. The higher self sees color, light, beauty. The observer sees the structure that holds those colors together, the lead lines, the joins, the symmetry that makes the light meaningful. Without the structure, there's only blur. Without the color, there's no reason to look. The two depend on each other, but only the observer can make the image intelligible. That's why some of your deepest realizations don't come as new ideas, but as shifts in how you see. You look at the same memory, the same person, the same recurring struggle, and suddenly, it's transparent. The details haven't changed, only the level of observation has. You're not interpreting anymore. You're perceiving the invisible scaffolding that holds your experience together. This translation of the invisible happens constantly, whether you notice it or not. It's there when you walk into a room and sense the unspoken tension, when you feel someone's honesty before they say a word, when you recognize that a choice feels aligned without knowing why. What's actually happening is that the observer has already processed the subtle field and converted it into felt clarity. Your intuition receives the signal after the translation has already taken place, but this mechanism only works when you're not trying to manipulate it. The observer's language is coherence, not control. When you attempt to force meaning onto an experience to make it spiritual, significant, or redemptive, you interrupt the translation. You start interpreting the invisible through the lens of desire. True translation happens only in neutrality. The observer can't hear through expectation. It can only render what's actually there. That's why the most profound insights often arise in moments of surrender. When you stop trying to read the universe and simply let it be visible, information begins to organize itself. Connections appear spontaneously. You understand without thinking. The observer is functioning freely, turning the invisible architecture of reality into a pattern you can comprehend. In science, coherence describes the alignment of waves moving in the same phase. When they synchronize, their amplitude multiplies. Their energy becomes clear and strong. Awareness works the same way. The more coherent your perception, the more powerfully reality expresses through you. The observer doesn't create this coherence, it reveals it. It lets you see how your own attention affects the field around you, how clarity isn't imposed on life, but drawn out of it by the quality of your gaze. That's why some experiences feel guided or cosmic without any mystical proof. It's not that the universe suddenly intervenes, it's that your observer reaches the level of resolution where the invisible pattern becomes readable. You begin to see meaning not as an overlay, but as a property of reality itself. The world starts to speak in alignments, in small coincidences, in the rhythm of timing. The invisible is always communicating. It just requires a translator precise enough to perceive context instead of chaos. And yet, that precision can be unsettling because it erases the illusion of randomness. You start noticing how every reaction, every delay, every encounter fits into a fabric that's larger than comprehension. The observer doesn't decode it intellectually, it resonates with it. The translation happens through frequency matching, not analysis. When your awareness holds still enough, it begins to vibrate at the same rhythm as the invisible forces shaping your experience. At that point, you don't just understand reality, you participate in its articulation. This participation changes the texture of your choices. You stop acting from intuition alone and begin acting from recognition. You don't need signs or validation anymore because you're no longer interpreting signals. You're operating from the field itself. You are the translation in motion. But there's a strange twist hidden inside this state. The more coherent your awareness becomes, the less personal it feels. The observer, once experienced as your awareness, starts revealing itself as a function of something much vaster. It's as if the universe were watching itself through your eyes, using your consciousness as an interface. The line between self and source begins to dissolve, not as an abstraction, but as a direct perception. And that's where the next revelation begins to unfold. Because once the invisible can translate itself through you, you start realizing the shocking truth about observation. It's not you observing you. It's something much larger, an awareness that belongs to the entire field of existence, looking back through the small aperture of your mind. What you thought was your private seeing is, in fact, the universe recognizing its own reflection. The moment it happens, it's almost disorienting. You've spent years trying to find that quiet, steady presence inside you, the watcher behind thought, the observer that sees without reacting. You've trained yourself to notice the mind's movement, to hold space between impulse and awareness. And then one day, the realization drops like a silent shock. The one who's observing isn't you. It doesn't arrive as a thought or a revelation. It's more like a shift in gravity. Something that had always seemed centered within your consciousness suddenly flips inside out. You're no longer the one looking out from behind your eyes. You're being looked through. The awareness you thought you possessed reveals itself as something infinitely wider, using your perspective as one of countless lenses. The observer isn't you observing you. It's the universe observing itself, momentarily localized as your life. At first, this truth feels like a betrayal. You've worked so hard to become aware, to polish perception, to refine attention, only to discover that awareness was never personal. The clarity you've cultivated wasn't yours. It was borrowed. You were the instrument, not the player. The thought is both humbling and liberating. Think of light passing through a window. The window doesn't shine, it transmits. When clean, it reflects the sky so perfectly that it almost disappears. You've spent years polishing your glass, mistaking the reflection of clarity for ownership of it. But now, as the light floods through, you understand. The glass never generated illumination. It only allowed it. This realization dismantles the last veil of spiritual identity. The higher self, once seen as the purest version of you, is revealed to be a voice generated by the same field that animates galaxies and gravity. The observer is that field's point of contact, the eye through which the cosmos studies its own behavior. Every act of noticing, every flash of intuition, every instance of awareness is not a personal achievement, but an event of the universe recognizing itself. That's the plot twist. There was never a you becoming enlightened. There was only consciousness folding back on itself to examine the pattern it's creating. The seeker and the sought are the same frequency playing two roles in one cosmic performance. But this understanding isn't meant to erase individuality. It recontextualizes it. The personality, the emotions, the memories, all of it remains, but they're no longer the main characters. They're expressions of the field's infinite curiosity about itself. The observer doesn't invalidate your humanity. It amplifies it. Because when awareness stops being personal, Empathy expands automatically. You stop viewing others as separate points of light and begin to sense them as extensions of the same seeing. And this changes how you relate to everything: joy, loss, time, even decision-making. You realize that when you choose, the universe is choosing through you. When you hesitate, it's hesitation exploring itself. Every movement becomes part of a larger choreography, not imposed by fate, but born from the inherent intelligence of coherence. The observer's vision isn't detached, it's participatory. This is why the line between inner and outer reality begins to blur. You notice how external events echo your internal states, how conversations appear precisely when reflection deepens, how the world seems to anticipate your realizations. It's not coincidence. It's the observer's field aligning itself, the fabric of perception adjusting to maintain balance as it expands. But this expansion has its own challenge. The mind, accustomed to boundaries, starts to panic in the vastness. It asks, if I'm not the observer, then what am I? That question, innocent as it sounds, is the last thread holding together the illusion of separateness. The answer can't be spoken, because any definition would reduce the boundless to a form. You can only live the question, breathing through the vertigo of dissolving identity until stability reappears, not as control, but as participation. Once you acclimate, life takes on a strange clarity. Ordinary moments feel charged with intelligence. The glance of a stranger, the rhythm of footsteps, the flicker of light on a wall, they're not signs to decode. They're expressions of the same awareness, peering through every angle of reality. You're not interpreting life anymore. You're part of its perception. And yet even here a paradox remains. The more you sense the universe observing through you, the more intimate everything feels. The infinite doesn't distance itself. It comes closer. The boundary between divine and mundane dissolves until brushing your hand against a table feels like touching the same presence that turns stars. That's the secret hidden in the plot twist. Awareness is not above life. It is life. The observer isn't looking at reality. It's streaming through it, animating each movement, each sound, each thought. The invisible intelligence you once sought is not watching from the sky. It's breathing through your nervous system, perceiving through your eyes, thinking through your mind. But this realization, as vast as it feels, isn't the end. Because once the universe begins to observe through you consciously, another transformation becomes possible. One where observation itself starts to fuse with experience, and the separation between knowing and living disappears completely. That's when coherence turns into embodiment, when the silent witness and the living presence finally recognize each other as the same pulse moving in both directions. There's a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when observation and existence stop being separate movements. You're no longer the one watching life happen, nor are you the one being watched. The two currents collapse into one seamless awareness, and in that convergence, coherence is born. You don't arrive there through practice or discipline. It happens the way dawn happens, gradually, imperceptibly, until you realize the light has changed and there's no trace of darkness left to measure it against. This is the silent fusion, the reunion of the observer and the higher self, the seeing and the being. It's not an event you witness, it's an atmosphere you become. The transition doesn't announce itself with ecstasy or revelation. In fact, it's marked by the absence of anything extraordinary. There's no insight, no voice, no sign, just a stillness so complete that it doesn't even feel like silence anymore. It feels like the natural state of everything. Up to this point, the journey has been defined by polarity. The higher self reaching upward toward transcendence, the observer looking downward toward comprehension, one aimed for light, the other for clarity. The fusion begins when neither aims anymore. The two realized they were never different, that their perspectives were just different sides of one awareness trying to meet itself. It's not the kind of unity that removes duality, it's the kind that renders it transparent. You still feel emotion, make choices, live as a person, but you're no longer inside experience trying to manage it. Experience happens through you as you, without friction. The observer doesn't stand apart anymore. The act of living is observation now. Imagine a candle burning in a dark room. The flame and the light it produces seem like two things, one source, one expression. But if you look closer, you realize there's no boundary between them. The fire is the light. You can't separate the radiance from its origin. That's what happens in the silent fusion. Awareness stops trying to witness its own glow and instead realizes it is the glow. What's striking about this state is its simplicity. The mind expects union to feel grand, an explosion of cosmic insight or bliss, but the reality is humbler, more intimate. You wake up one morning and realize that the usual mental noise has lost its authority. Thoughts arise and dissolve without trace, like ripples in a lake too vast to remember disturbance. There's no effort to maintain clarity, no fear of losing it. Awareness sustains itself, and in that sustaining, perception sharpens. You start to notice the micro-textures of existence, the pause between words, the subtle hum behind ordinary sounds, the intelligence hidden in timing. Every event seems to contain its own explanation. You don't analyze anymore, you simply understand. The observer, now merged with the higher self, translates reality directly into being, meaning no longer needs interpretation. It's not that you stop thinking or feeling. It's that thought and feeling become transparent to awareness, moving freely like light through clear water. Even conflict appears differently. You can sense pain without suffering from it, sense uncertainty without collapsing into fear. The human story continues, but it unfolds in the presence of something vast and neutral, not detached but unmoved. That neutrality is not indifference, it's intelligence in perfect balance. This coherence radiates outward. People around you sense it without knowing why. They feel safer, calmer, more open in your presence. It's not charisma, it's resonance. When observation and being fuse, your entire field harmonizes. You stop emitting contradiction, words match energy, action matches intention. Communication becomes less about expression and more about transmission. You no longer explain truth, you embody it. In this fusion, the boundaries between inner and outer dissolve further. You start noticing how reality adjusts itself in response to your internal state, not because of will or manifestation, but because perception and environment are now one continuum. The observer's seeing is the world's self-arrangement. Every glance, every thought, every gesture becomes part of the field's choreography. But even this state, as serene as it feels, carries a subtle paradox. The moment you try to grasp it, it disappears. The instant you think, this is it, the separation returns. Because fusion isn't something to be held. It's something that happens when holding ceases. The mind wants to repeat it, to replicate its stillness, but repetition belongs to time, and fusion exists only outside of it. The awareness that tries to keep coherence reintroduces the very division it had transcended. So instead of trying to sustain it, you learn to trust it. You allow awareness to breathe through form as naturally as wind through leaves. There's no longer a need to alternate between meditation and activity, silence and sound. Every moment becomes both, contemplative and alive, still and in motion. You start to sense that the entire world is meditating through you, that existence itself is maintaining the equilibrium. And it's within that balance of the effortless circulation between observation and action that another kind of knowing begins to unfold. Not abstract, not spiritual, but immediate and tactile. The recognition that the same intelligence animating your breath is orchestrating the rhythm of everything around you. And that recognition doesn't speak in philosophy or belief. It speaks in sensation, in the way your body, thought, and environment suddenly move as one continuous gesture, guided by something deeper than intention, something that has been here since before the first thought of I am ever arose. Take a moment and notice this. As you read these words, there's something inside you that's aware of reading. It's not the eyes or the voice in your head pronouncing the sentences, it's the silent presence behind both. The still awareness that doesn't move even as thoughts flicker across it. That's not imagination or philosophy. It's the most verifiable experience you can have. The observer right now is present, active, and effortless. You don't have to summon it or visualize anything mystical. You simply pause for half a breath and ask yourself, who is noticing this thought? Don't answer with words. Just let the question hang. In that instant of suspension, before the mind rushes to label, explain, or describe, you're touching the observer directly. It's there in the gap between question and answer, the space between perception and interpretation. It's subtle, yes, but unmistakable once you catch it. It doesn't feel like an emotion or a thought. It feels like clarity itself, impersonal, neutral, and awake. You can test it anywhere, at a traffic light, in a meeting, during an argument. Every moment contains that same threshold between automatic reaction and conscious seeing. The act of noticing that threshold is the practical gateway to coherence. This is what it means to bring the observer into daily life. It's not about detaching from experience or pretending to be calm. It's about introducing awareness into movement, so perception and action begin to align in real time. When you're speaking, can you feel the silence behind your words? When you're listening, can you sense the stillness that receives the sound before meaning forms? That's the practice. Micro, invisible, but revolutionary in effect. What happens when you do this consistently is subtle at first. Time seems to stretch slightly. The usual rush of judgment softens. You find yourself pausing half a second longer before reacting, and in that half second, the world opens. The body relaxes without your telling it to. Choices that once felt pressured start to self-organize. You begin to sense that awareness doesn't need control to direct reality. Observation itself is direction. In the modern world, where attention is constantly fragmented, this simple shift has enormous implications. You stop leaking energy into interpretation. You realize that most exhaustion isn't physical, it's perceptual. It comes from resisting the present moment, from trying to rearrange what already is. Observation dissolves that resistance. When you see clearly, there's nothing left to fight, only to participate in. Try this experiment. Close your eyes for just a few seconds and focus not on your breath, but on the awareness of breathing. Don't deepen or slow it. Let it do what it does. Simply feel the body moving on its own, the air entering and leaving without your permission. That's life observing itself through you. When you notice that, your identification with the doer softens. Breathing becomes observation, not effort. Now open your eyes again and look around the room. Instead of naming objects, notice the simple fact that seeing is happening. You're not the one forcing the seeing. It's occurring through you. The mind, so used to claiming ownership, will try to step in and describe it. Let it. Watch that too. The moment you watch even your description, awareness expands again. Over time, this shift creates a kind of gravity in your perception. Life begins to organize around awareness rather than will. You notice that clarity doesn't depend on mood or circumstance. It's not something to regain after chaos. It's the ground that chaos moves through. The more you practice, the less separation you feel between observing and living. You're not maintaining a state. You're allowing one to reveal itself moment by moment. This integration also changes how emotion behaves. Instead of suppressing or indulging feelings, you start to observe their architecture, where they arise in the body, how they crest and fade. You begin to understand that emotion is just energy passing through the lens of perception. The observer doesn't interfere. It provides enough space for energy to complete its cycle. What used to feel overwhelming becomes informative, and something else starts to happen. Coherence moves outward. The same field that stabilizes your perception begins to affect your surroundings. Conversations flow more easily, timing becomes precise, coincidences multiply. You're not forcing synchronicity, you're resonating with it. The observer translates subtle alignment into physical rhythm. The most beautiful part of this practice is its ordinariness. There's no ritual, no mantra, no special posture. The world itself becomes the meditation, the hum of the refrigerator, the feel of fabric on skin, the sound of footsteps fading down a hallway. Each moment is an opportunity to verify awareness. You don't need to wait for inspiration or spiritual context. The observer is as real in the grocery line as it is in the quiet of meditation. And when awareness stabilizes like this, you start noticing that life no longer feels like something happening to you. It feels like something happening through you. You act, you feel, you decide. but none of it carries the weight of ownership. You begin to trust movement itself, to sense the intelligence inside spontaneity. It's not mystical surrender, it's precision. The universe moving through a body that's finally clear enough to transmit without distortion. And once this transmission becomes natural, another threshold appears. Awareness, having recognized itself within the personal, begins to sense its reflection beyond the self, in others, in nature, in the collective pulse of reality. The next realization is no longer about personal observation, but about the network of awareness itself, the shared field of seeing that connects every consciousness, waiting to be recognized as one continuous act of perception. In the end, the observer was never separate from you. It was the quiet current running beneath every thought, every intuition, every heartbeat. When you learn to rest in that still awareness, life stops being something you interpret and becomes something you inhabit. The universe is not watching from afar. It's perceiving itself through your eyes, moving through your choices, breathing through your existence. The silence you once feared is not emptiness, it's pure participation. If you felt that recognition, even for a second, it means the observer is awake in you right now. Write "I'm still here" in the comments, so I know you made it to the end of this journey. And if this message resonated, tap one of the videos on the screen to keep exploring this deeper layer of awareness. There's more waiting for you, not to be learned, but to be seen.